I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, holding the hanger like it contained the last fragile piece of hope I had left. The pale emerald dress shimmered faintly in the late afternoon light, the kind of fabric that seemed to breathe when you moved. I'd bought it 3 weeks ago from a boutique I'd only ever walked past, the kind with window displays so perfectly arranged you felt you'd mess something up just by breathing near them. I'd told myself I couldn't justify the price. Then I'd reminded myself this was Graham's wedding, my only child, my only son. And if there was ever a day to step into a version of myself I hadn't felt in years, this was it. At 63, I wasn't naive about what a dress could do. It couldn't erase the fine lines at the corners of my eyes, or the silver streaks that refused to blend into dye anymore. It couldn't give me back the quick, careless beauty I had at 25, when Edward used to look at me like I was sunlight. But it could remind me I was still a woman, not just a widow, not just someone's mother. 4 years had passed since Edward died, and while the ache had dulled, the house had never stopped feeling too quiet. I'd filled the silence with painting, with tending to my tiny garden, with the occasional lunch with former colleagues. But there had always been something missing. Connection. Family that felt close in more than name. That was why today mattered. I wanted Graham's marriage to work. I wanted it to be more than pretty pictures and polite smiles. And if I was honest, I wanted Sabrina to like me. More than that, I wanted her to see me as more than Graham's mom. Maybe even the daughter I'd never had. Sabrina was everything I'd imagined a daughter might be. Young, elegant, full of life. The kind of woman who filled a room effortlessly. In the months since Graham had introduced her, I'd been careful. Not too much advice, not too much opinion, just enough warmth to show I cared. I didn't want to make the mistakes I'd seen other mothers make, smothering their adult children until resentment bloomed. My fingers traced the hem of the dress, feeling the faint roughness where the seamstress had shortened it. I'd chosen it because the color brought out the green in my eyes, the same green Graham had inherited. I wondered if he'd notice. I hoped he would. Slipping it on, I studied my reflection. The neckline was modest but flattering, the sleeves just enough to cover the soft skin of my arms. I'd paired it with the pearl earrings Edward had given me on our 10th anniversary, the ones I hadn't worn since his funeral. I wanted to carry a piece of him with me today, even if it was just in the small curve of a pearl resting against my neck. On the dresser, my phone buzzed with a notification from the family group chat. Sabrina had sent a picture of the venue decorated in cascading white roses. "Can't wait to see everyone tonight," she'd written, adding a trail of champagne glass emojis. I typed and deleted my reply 3 times before settling on, "Looks beautiful. See you soon." I checked the time. The ceremony was at 4. I had just enough to finish my makeup and drive the 40 minutes to the venue. As I applied my lipstick, a muted rose I'd worn to countless important moments in my life, I felt that familiar tremor in my hands. Not from nerves exactly, but from the weight of wanting things to go right, wanting to be part of something that felt like family again. I thought about Graham as a boy, how his hand used to slip into mine without thinking, how he'd ask me to watch him build Lego castles on the living room floor, his face lighting up when I said they were masterpieces. Somewhere along the way, that closeness had thinned, not vanished. He still called, still visited. But there was a distance now, like he'd stepped into a new orbit, and I was watching from far away. I told myself that was normal, that grown children needed their own lives. But a part of me hoped that today, seeing me there, seeing me proud, might bridge that space. Sliding on my shoes, low heels, practical but still elegant, I took one last look in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was older, yes, but there was still a spark, still a chance that today could be the start of something better. I grabbed my clutch, locked the front door, and stepped into the crisp air. The dress moved with me, catching the light just enough to remind me I was still here, still capable of being seen. I didn't know what the day would hold. I just knew I was walking toward it with hope stitched into every seam. The venue rose ahead of me like something out of a bridal magazine. Ivory columns, sweeping glass doors, the faint shimmer of fairy lights spilling into the daylight. My heart thudded, not from the climb up the stone steps, but from the anticipation of seeing Graham in his tux, of being part of this day. I walked in clutching my clutch like a lifeline, the emerald of my dress catching soft reflections from the chandelier overhead. Graham stood near the entrance, talking to a group of groomsmen. When he noticed me, he broke from the circle with a smile that was polite but shallow. "Mom, you made it." His arms came around me briefly, more like checking a box than an embrace. I held on a second longer than he did. Of course I made it. I wouldn't miss this for the world. But his eyes had already drifted past me toward the lobby, where I saw a flash of white silk and Sabrina's high, ringing laugh. He gave my arm a quick squeeze and said, "I've got to check on something with the photographer. Make yourself comfortable," before vanishing into the swirl of tuxedos and chiffon. I stood there for a moment, feeling the faintest chill despite the hum of warm air from the vents. A smiling young woman with a headset and clipboard appeared. "Seating chart is right this way, Mrs. Carrington." She led me to an ornate easel draped in greenery. My eyes scanned the neatly lettered cards, starting at the head table. Graham Carrington and Sabrina Wolfe. Sabrina's parents, her sister and fiancé. Names I recognized as her cousins. I followed the list downward, row after row of family and close friends clustered near the center. My gaze dropped to the far right column. Table 14, Lydia Carrington, alongside three couples I had never heard of. My stomach tightened. "There must be a mistake," I said, my voice steady but cool. "I'm the groom's mother." The planner checked her clipboard. "Table 14 is correct, as requested." Requested by whom? I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. "Bride and groom approved all seating," she said with that professionally pleasant tone that meant the conversation was over. I nodded, as if that made perfect sense, even though a small hot ember of humiliation had begun to burn in my chest. Sabrina's doing. The thought settled like a stone in my stomach. This was deliberate. Too deliberate to be an oversight. And Graham, he'd let it stand. I walked toward the reception hall, heels clicking softly against polished marble. The space was breathtaking. High arched ceilings, white roses cascading from crystal vases, candlelight flickering along mirrored table runners. It smelled faintly of jasmine and champagne. I found table 14 tucked near the back corner, beside a service door. The linens were the same, the centerpieces just as lush, but from here the head table was a distant island, framed by guest shoulders and the broad sweep of the dance floor. I pulled out my chair and sat, smoothing the skirt of my dress, willing myself not to look like someone who had just been set aside. Around me, the other guests introduced themselves, friends of Sabrina's parents from their golf club. They were polite enough, but their conversation was about vacations I couldn't relate to and people I'd never met. I smiled where appropriate, nodding as they compared ski resorts. But inside, I felt the sharp edges of what had just happened. It wasn't about distance in feet. It was about message. The mother of the groom belonged here, in the shadows, where she could watch but not touch, hear but not speak. I glanced toward the head table again. Sabrina sat between Graham and her father, leaning in to whisper something that made her father laugh. Graham's profile was unreadable, but he didn't look my way once. The ember in my chest flared. This was my son, my only son. and he had either agreed to this or decided it wasn't worth objecting to. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, not to ruin the day with assumptions, but the truth was bitter on my tongue. Some things didn't happen without permission, and I knew my son well enough to recognize the quiet weight of his compliance. I reached for the water glass in front of me, taking a slow sip to keep my hand steady. The dress felt heavier now, the pearls at my ears less like a tribute, and more like armor I wasn't sure would hold. I'd come here hoping for warmth, for a chance to belong again. Instead, I'd been placed at the farthest edge, as if I were a distant relative to be managed rather than family to be celebrated. I folded my napkin neatly in my lap and fixed my face into a smile. If this was the first cut of the day, I had a sinking feeling it wouldn't be the last. The ceremony began like something pulled from the pages of a bridal magazine. Peonies spilled from tall glass vases at the end of each aisle, their soft blush petals catching the candlelight that lined the runner. The air carried a faint sweetness, mingling with the low, lilting notes of a string quartet tucked into the corner. I sat in my seat at table 14 during the prelude, then moved forward for the ceremony, weaving past strangers who greeted me politely without knowing who I was. The room hushed as Graham appeared at the front in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. For a moment, I saw him as the boy who once wore a suit 2 sizes too big for his middle school concert, beaming at me from the stage. My chest swelled with something close to pride, and I let myself believe, just for a breath, that the cold greeting earlier and the sting of the seating chart might fade into the background of a perfect day. Then the doors at the back opened. Sabrina stood framed in the doorway, white silk fitted to her like a second skin, veil floating behind her. She was undeniably beautiful. The guests rose, a collective sigh of admiration rolling through the space. She began her slow walk down the aisle, arm looped through her father's. The quartet swelled, the peonies seemed to lean toward her, and every camera in the room was trained on her face. My gaze shifted to Graham. His expression was fixed on her with a softness I hadn't seen directed at me in years. When they finally stood together, the officiant's voice rose above the quiet, welcoming everyone, speaking of love, unity, and family. I folded my hands in my lap, listening to the words, telling myself this was the start of something good. But as Sabrina's vows began, her voice gentle but clear, she suddenly glanced away from Graham, straight at me. It wasn't a fleeting look. It was deliberate, held for just long enough that I felt the muscles in my neck tighten. Then she smirked. Not the nervous, shy kind that might escape during emotional moments. This was small, sharp, knowing. A private signal, though no one else would recognize it as such. My stomach nodded. It was the kind of smirk a person gave when they'd already decided the outcome of a game you didn't even know you were playing. I forced my gaze back to Graham, but my pulse had changed. The warmth I'd been building in my chest turned cold. She returned her attention to him, delivering the rest of her vows with perfect poise. The guests sighed at her promises, the photographer's flash catching her every angle. When it was Graham's turn, his voice was steady, filled with words about how she'd changed his life, how lucky he felt. I waited for some mention of where he came from, of the mother who'd stood by him through years of scraped knees and harder nights. Nothing. My name wasn't spoken once. The quartet played softly as they exchanged rings, the sparkle of diamonds under the chandeliers. I looked around at the faces of Sabrina's family, glowing with pride, leaning toward one another with warmth and familiarity. Then I glanced down the aisle toward my place at the back, already distant from all of this. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Applause and cheers filled the room as they kissed, framed by candlelight and flowers. The guests rose to their feet, clapping, some even dabbing their eyes. I clapped too, but the sound felt hollow in my own ears. When Graham and Sabrina turned to walk back down the aisle, her eyes found mine again, just for a split second, the corners of her mouth curving upward, not in joy, but in quiet triumph. A chill slid down my spine. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into a look. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen that kind of smile before, the kind that says, "I've already won." I stayed seated until the rows ahead of me cleared, then rose, smoothing my dress and adjusting the pearl earring that suddenly felt heavier. Around me, people were buzzing about how perfect the ceremony was, how radiant the bride looked. I murmured agreement, keeping my voice even, but in my mind the picture had already shifted. The flowers, the candlelight, the music, it was all surface. Beneath it, something colder was running through the day, and it had just looked me straight in the eye. I walked toward the reception hall slowly, telling myself to breathe, to stay composed. But with every step, I could feel it building, the sense that the worst part of this day hadn't even begun. The reception hall glowed in warm light, the chandeliers casting golden halos over the tables. Candlelight flickered in tall crystal holders, catching on the glassware, making everything look more expensive, more perfect. The scent of peonies still lingered from the ceremony, now mingled with champagne and roasted lamb. The head table was a stage, Graham and Sabrina in the center, her family flanking them, laughter spilling out in polished bursts. From table 14, I could see them clearly, but it felt like watching a play from the cheap seats, too far away to be part of the scene. Plates had been cleared, dessert served. The air was full of clinking forks and cheerful conversation when the MC tapped the microphone, announcing it was time for toasts. Sabrina's father spoke first. Warm, easy, the kind of man who could make an entire room feel like old friends. He welcomed Graham into their family, his voice rich with sincerity. There was applause, a few good-natured laughs. Then Graham stood. My heart caught. Maybe now he'd bridge the gap, acknowledge me, say something that made me feel like I belonged in his day. He smiled at Sabrina, spoke about her beauty, her intelligence, the way she'd made him better. Guests sighed at the sweetness, some raising their glasses. Not a word about me. Not one. The MC started to move on, but Sabrina was already reaching for the microphone, her champagne flute in the other hand. "I have a special toast," she said, voice bright, carrying easily over the hum of conversation. "But first, I need everyone's attention for something fun." Laughter and chatter quieted. I felt an odd ripple of unease before she even began. She looked out over the crowd, then directly at me. "As many of you know, Graham's mother, Lydia, hasn't been feeling her best lately." My stomach tightened. The room waited. "She's been such a burden?" She caught herself with a feigned smile. "I mean, such a concern for poor Graham." So I thought, why not have a little auction? Who'll take my sick mother-in-law home tonight? Laughter burst across the room, light, startled, but growing. Some faces registered shock. Others leaned in as if this was the entertainment portion of the evening. My cheeks burned. My hands clenched around my napkin until my knuckles ached. It was absurd, a cruel little performance wrapped in a veneer of humor. But it was public, and that made it dangerous. "Come on, Graham," she called, looking down the table at him. "What would you bid for your dear mother?" The entire hall turned to him. This was the moment. He could shut it down, laugh awkwardly and say, "Not funny, Sabrina," or remind everyone that I was his mother. He could put an end to it. Instead, he grinned. "I'll give $12, he said, lifting his glass in a mock toast. The room roared. Laughter rolled over me like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs. I sat frozen, my face fixed, my body heavy in the chair. My son. The boy I had worked 2 jobs to raise after his father died. The young man I had cheered for at every graduation, every milestone. The man I had believed would protect me if the world ever turned cruel. $12. My mind grasped at years of memories. The nights I stayed up sewing his costume for the school play. The mornings I skipped breakfast so he'd have enough lunch money. The car I helped him buy when he was starting his first job. Every sacrifice collapsed into that single number. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to keep my eyes forward, but my vision blurred at the edges. People were laughing, shaking their heads as if this was all harmless fun. A few glanced at me, their smiles faltering, but none spoke up. Not even Graham. Not even the son I'd believed would never let anyone diminish me in public. The music from the speakers swelled again, as Sabrina handed the microphone back, satisfied. I looked down at my hands, the napkin crumpled into a small, tight ball. I smoothed it against my lap, willing my face to stay composed. Inside, something sharp lodged deeper in my chest. I knew then that this wasn't just a bad joke. This was a message, and it had been delivered, clearly and deliberately in front of everyone who mattered to them. The laughter was still echoing around the hall, a ripple of amusement that felt like it had teeth. I stared at my plate, trying to hold my expression steady while the heat in my face spread down my neck. Then, from just to my left, a man's voice cut through the noise, deep, calm, and carrying without effort. $3 million. The words hung in the air like a struck bell. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Somewhere across the room, a chair scraped against the floor. Sabrina's champagne glass slipped from her hand, hitting the edge of the table before shattering on the polished wood floor, the fizz spilling across white linen. The hall went dead silent. I turned to my left. The man who had spoken rose slowly from his chair. He wore a charcoal suit cut so precisely, it looked like it belonged only to him. His posture was straight, his presence so self-assured it seemed to draw the light toward him. He wasn't smiling. His gaze was locked on the head table, and the weight of it made even the chatterboxes in the room shrink into quiet. $3 million, he repeated, voice steady, every syllable deliberate. For the privilege of caring for this remarkable woman. I blinked at him, my mind struggling to make sense of the words, of him. I'd noticed him earlier, seated beside me at table 14, polite but quiet during dinner. His conversation limited to a few courteous remarks about the music and the flowers. I hadn't known his name. Now, standing beside me, he seemed suddenly larger, as if the space itself adjusted around him. Sabrina stared, eyes wide, lips parted. Graham's expression flickered between confusion and something closer to alarm. "I'm sorry," Graham said finally, half rising from his chair. "Who exactly are you?" The man's dark eyes didn't leave Sabrina's face. Dr. Omar Darwish. The name struck something deep in me, like opening a door I'd shut decades ago. My breath caught, my pulse stumbling into a faster rhythm. My voice came without my permission, a whisper. "Omar?" He turned then, and for a moment, the years fell away. His hair was silver now, but the strong lines of his face were the same. Those same eyes, dark, unwavering, looked into mine with recognition so sharp it was almost physical. "Hello, Lydia," he said softly, and the sound of it pulled me backward in time. I was 23 again, standing in the corridor of St. Jude's Hospital, the scent of antiseptic in the air. He was a young surgical resident then, fresh from Jordan, brilliant and intense, with hands that could calm a patient's heartbeat or stitch a wound as neatly as if it had never been there. We had met over an emergency case, passing instruments to each other in the middle of a midnight crisis. I had been engaged to Edward at the time, Steady, dependable Edward. My parents' choice. My safe future. But Omar had been something else entirely. For 6 months, we had existed in a dangerous in-between. Conversations that lasted hours, moments in quiet hallways when his hand would brush mine, the pull between us undeniable. He had asked me once in the low light of the staff lounge to come with him when his residency ended, to build a life together in Jordan. And I had said no. Out of fear, out of duty, out of the kind of hesitation that only makes sense when you're too young to understand what it will cost you. He had left without another word. I had married Edward. We had built a life, raised Graham, and Omar had become a memory I carried like a pressed flower in a book. Beautiful, but locked away. And now here he was, standing in the middle of my son's wedding reception, offering $3 million to undo the cruelty I had just endured. The guests began to murmur again, the tension shifting into something electric. Sabrina's face had gone pale beneath her flawless makeup. Graham looked between Omar and me, suspicion and confusion warring on his features. $3 million? Sabrina repeated, her voice higher now, almost a laugh. You can't be serious. Omar turned his gaze to her fully, and it was like watching steel being drawn from a sheath. I am completely serious, he said. And though I suspect Mrs. Carrington is worth far more than any sum, the offer stands. His words were calm, but there was an edge under them that made the room lean in, listening. My own breath felt caught somewhere in my ribs. I wanted to speak, to ask 100 questions, to close the gap between us, but I couldn't seem to move. The man I had loved and lost was here, and he had chosen this moment to step back into my life. Not quietly, but in a way no one could ignore. The hall was still frozen, all eyes on him, on us. And in that stillness, I understood one thing with piercing clarity. Nothing about this day would ever be the same again. The sound of his name on my lips felt strange, like speaking a word I'd hidden away for decades. Omar. It had been 40 years since I'd last seen him, yet in that instant, the hall, the wedding, the eyes of 300 guests all faded. I was 23 again, walking through the antiseptic bright corridors of St. Jude's Hospital, with my hair pulled back tight and my heart beating faster than I cared to admit. Back then, I was Lydia Mercer, newly engaged to Edward Carrington, a man who was steady, kind, and safe. My parents adored him. He worked at the bank, came from a good family, and had a future mapped out in neat, predictable lines. That was supposed to be enough for me. Then Omar Darwish arrived. He was the new surgical resident from Amman, Jordan, sharp-minded and sharper-eyed, with a focus that made everyone around him straighten their posture. The first time we worked together was during a midnight emergency. A cardiac patient had been rushed in, and we were short-staffed. He appeared at my station with calm urgency, requesting instruments I handed over almost before he asked. His hands moved with confidence, the kind that came from both skill and an unshakable sense of purpose. "You're quick," he said, once the patient was stable, his accent soft but precise. "You keep your head in the storm." I remember blushing, not because of the words, but because of the way he looked at me, directly, as though he saw something more than my starched uniform and careful politeness. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed more often. He lingered at the nurse's station after his rounds, asking about my patients, my opinions, my life. We discovered a shared love for poetry. He brought me a worn copy of Gibran one night, tucking it into my bag without a word. Sometimes we'd sit in the staff lounge during slow hours, talking about things that had nothing to do with medicine. He told me about his home, the olive trees outside his bedroom window, the scent of jasmine at night, the desert sky so clear you could see forever. I told him about the little coastal town where I'd grown up, how I'd always thought I'd leave, but never imagined I'd end up in a city hospital instead. There was a pull between us that I tried to ignore. I told myself it was harmless, just friendship. But then there was the night in the on-call room, after we'd spent hours stabilizing a trauma patient. We were both exhausted, sitting in silence, when he said quietly, "I shouldn't be here." I thought he meant the hospital. "Where should you be?" I asked. He looked at me in a way that made my breath catch. "I shouldn't be here, falling in love with a woman who belongs to someone else." My heart stuttered. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I was committed to Edward, that this couldn't happen. Instead, I said nothing. And in that silence, something between us deepened. For 6 months, we lived in a quiet, dangerous in-between, shared coffees, conversations that stretched long past our shifts, brief touches that burned far longer than they lasted. He asked me once, late at night, to come with him when his residency ended. "We can build a life together in Amen. We'll help people. We'll see the world." I wanted to say yes. God, I wanted to. But the fear was louder. Fear of leaving everything I knew. Fear of disappointing my parents. Fear that once we were there, he might realize I wasn't enough. "I can't," I whispered, tears slipping down my cheeks. He didn't argue. He just took my hands in his, holding them like something fragile. "Then I will go," he said quietly. And he did. A month later, he was gone. No goodbye, no letter, just the absence of him in every hallway, every shift, every quiet corner of the hospital. I married Edward 6 months after that. He was a good husband. We had Graham. We built a home. We had a life. But there were moments, small, private moments, when I'd catch myself wondering about a life that never happened. Wondering what it would have been like to wake up under the desert sky he'd described, to walk among those olive trees. I buried those thoughts. You can't live your life staring at a road you didn't take. And yet, seeing him now, standing in this ballroom in a charcoal suit, silver at his temples, the same steady fire in his eyes, it was as if no time had passed. The years between us collapsed, and I could feel every moment we'd lost pressing down on me. He had left heartbroken. I had stayed safe. And now somehow he was here, offering to stand between me and the cruelty of this day without hesitation. I didn't know why. I didn't know what it meant. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The past I had tried to bury had never really died. It had been waiting. Omar's gaze swept the hall like a blade, calm but cutting. "What I just witnessed," he said, his voice carrying easily without a microphone, "wasn't humor. It was abuse. A son allowing his mother to be humiliated for entertainment. A wife orchestrating cruelty under the guise of a joke." The silence was absolute. Even the servers froze mid-step, trays balanced in their hands. Sabrina's lips parted, her eyes darting toward Graham as if to cue him to speak, to smooth things over. Graham cleared his throat. "Dr. Darwish, I think you're misunderstanding." Omar turned to him with a level stare. "Number, I understand perfectly. You sat there while your wife auctioned off your mother like she was unwanted furniture, and you laughed. That's not misunderstanding, Graham. That's neglect. That's cowardice." A ripple of murmurs rolled through the room. I felt every pair of eyes flick between us, waiting to see if I'd shrink further into my chair or finally stand. My hands trembled, but not from fear anymore. Slowly, I rose. My chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. "You want to talk about value?" I said, my voice steadying as I looked at Graham. "Let's talk about what $12 bought you, son." His jaw tightened. "Mom?" "No, I cut in. You don't get to stop me. Not after that. I turned so my voice carried, not just to him, but to every guest in the hall. When your father died, you were 17. Do you remember the mortgage notice that came a month later? I do. I worked double shifts at the clinic to keep the house. I sold my wedding ring to pay for your first car so you could get to school, and your part-time job. I took out a second mortgage to send you to college because you said you didn't want loans hanging over you. I made sure you had everything you needed, even if it meant I went without. And tonight, in front of strangers, you told me I was worth $12. His face flushed crimson, his mouth opening but no words coming. I let the silence stretch. That wasn't just a joke, Graham. That was every selfish choice you've made these past few years, dressed up in a tuxedo and handed a microphone. Sabrina's fingers twisted in her napkin, her smile faltering. Lydia, it was... Don't, I snapped, turning to her. Don't you dare pretend this was harmless. You planned this. You thought it would be funny to humiliate me in front of 300 people. You put me at the back of the room like a distant cousin, then turned me into the evening's punchline. You've made it clear from the day we met that you don't see me as family. Well, congratulations, Sabrina. You've made sure I feel the same way about you. A murmur of agreement rippled through the tables closest to me. I caught the flicker of embarrassment on her parents' faces, her mother looking down at her lap, her father shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Omar's voice came again, measured, but edged with steel. What you've done tonight will follow you, he said to them both. Not because I'll make sure of it, but because every person in this room will remember how you treated the woman who raised you, Graham. And when you try to spin it as a joke, they'll remember the look on her face. Sabrina's charm was gone now, stripped bare under the weight of the stairs she couldn't charm her way out of. Her mouth opened, but whatever defense she'd been reaching for died in her throat. Graham shifted in his seat, glancing at the guests, at the phones that had quietly been raised to record. The tide had turned. Where moments ago there had been laughter, now there was judgment, some faces openly disapproving, others whispering to each other. I felt something inside me loosen, not joy exactly, but relief. Relief that the truth had finally been said out loud, not in private where it could be brushed off or respun, but here, where everyone could see it for what it was. Sit down, I told Graham quietly, and for once, he did. The rest of the room followed suit, the air charged, the music still paused as if even the quartet didn't dare break the moment. Omar stepped back, his hand brushing lightly against my arm as I took my seat again, my head high. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. And from the looks on their faces, neither did anyone else in the room. The wedding planner appeared at my elbow, her voice low but urgent. Mrs. Carrington, perhaps we should step into a side room. Just for a moment. I didn't need to ask why. The air in the reception hall had gone sharp, the stares too focused, the whispers too constant. Graham was already making his way toward me, jaw tight, Sabrina at his side, every inch the picture of a bride who just had her spotlight stolen. We followed the planner down a short hallway into a smaller lounge, dimly lit, with velvet chairs and a faint scent of old wood polish. The door shut behind us, cutting off the hum of the guests. Graham turned first. Mom, what was that? You completely overreacted out there. I stared at him. Overreacted? You auctioned off your mother for $12? He sighed like I'd missed the point entirely. It was just a joke. Everyone was laughing. At me, I cut in. Do you hear yourself? That was your wedding, and you made me the punchline. Oh, for God's sake, Sabrina said, her voice pitched with practiced patience. We were having a little fun. You're taking this so seriously. I looked at her, letting my silence do the work. She shifted, smoothing her dress. Look, Graham said. I'm sorry if it came across wrong, but it wasn't meant to hurt you. But it did, I said simply. And you let it. Before he could answer, Omar spoke from where he'd been leaning against the wall, watching. Interesting, he said, his tone mild, but not kind. You're this quick to defend your wife's cruelty, Graham. Tell me, are you this quick to defend your colleagues? Graham blinked. What are you talking about? Omar stepped forward, and the room seemed to shrink around his presence. Med Supply North America, he said. That's where you work, correct? Graham frowned. Yes. Why? Because Al Darwish Global, Omar said evenly, owns a controlling interest in Med Supply North America. Acquired it last year, which means indirectly, I sign your checks. The words landed like stones. Graham's mouth opened, then closed. Sabrina's head snapped toward him, then back to Omar, her eyes suddenly bright with a different kind of calculation. I didn't know, Graham said. No, Omar replied. You didn't. But now you do. And now you also know that when I receive quarterly culture reports on that company, I'll remember tonight. The way you allowed public cruelty towards someone who raised you. The way you laughed. Sabrina's voice slid in, warm with sudden charm. Dr. Darwish, she began, stepping toward him. I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. If we'd known you were connected to the family, we would have treated Lydia with the respect she deserves. She smiled, a careful tilt of the head. Perhaps we could start over. Have dinner sometime. I'd love to hear more about your work. Omar didn't move. If you need a reason to treat someone with respect, he said slowly, you've already failed. And I have no interest in dinners with people who use cruelty as entertainment. Her smile wavered, the polish cracking for just a heartbeat. Graham stepped in again, his voice strained. This doesn't have to get complicated. We can move past it. I looked at him. Past it? You think this is a blip in the evening, Graham? This is the clearest picture I've had of you in years. He flinched but said nothing. Omar's voice was quieter now, but still carried weight. I didn't come here to interfere. I came to see Lydia again. But when I saw what you were willing to do, or to let be done, I couldn't stay silent. You don't value her. That much is obvious. But I do. The room was still. Sabrina's eyes flicked between us, the quick mental math of a woman realizing her leverage had just evaporated. Graham shifted his weight, his confidence gone, and for the first time all night, he looked unsure of himself. The power had moved. It was no longer theirs. And they knew it. The lounge had gone quiet after Omar's last words, the kind of quiet that hummed with things unsaid. Graham stared at the carpet like he could will it to open up and swallow him. Sabrina was the first to recover, straightening her posture and forcing a tight smile, as if she could press the evening back into shape by sheer will. Lydia, she said, her tone coated in honey. I think we all need to take a breath. You're clearly upset. But let's be reasonable. This is Graham's wedding day. No one wants to dwell on a little misunderstanding. The way she said little made my jaw tighten. That little misunderstanding was deliberate, I replied. You knew exactly what you were doing. She gave a small shrug, like I just confirmed what she already knew. I think you're reading too much into it. I didn't bother answering. Omar stepped forward then, his presence somehow pulling the air toward him. Lydia, he said, his voice softer now. I want to ask you something. I turned to him. The directness in his eyes left no space for doubt or deflection. Come with me, he said simply. To Amman, to my home. Let me show you the life we could have had. The life we could still have. For a moment, all I could do was stare at him. The words hit a part of me I'd long since locked away, a part that had never stopped wondering what if. Omar, I started, but he lifted a hand, not to silence me, but to steady the moment. I'm not asking for an answer right now. I know it's a lot, but I've lived a long time without you. I don't want to waste what time we might still have. I glanced at Graham. He looked up then, and for a second I thought I saw something. Remorse, maybe. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a furrowed brow. Mom, you can't just run off with him. You barely know each other anymore. I know her, Omar said, his gaze still fixed on me. Better than you think. This is ridiculous, Sabrina cut in, her voice carrying that clipped edge she used when she was done pretending. She's upset, and you're trying to take advantage of it. Omar didn't even look at her. The only advantage I'm taking, he said evenly, is the chance to offer her respect, something she clearly doesn't get here. Graham's jaw tightened. Mom, you're overreacting. We made a joke, it landed wrong. Can we not blow this up into something bigger than it is? I took a breath, feeling the truth crystallize in my chest. That's the difference between you and me, Graham. To you, this was a joke. To me, it was the moment I realized you stopped seeing me as a person. His face twitched, like he wanted to argue, but the words never came. I looked back at Omar. In the space between us, I could feel the pull of history and possibility both at once. Part of me still hesitated. The years of habit, of putting Graham first, of thinking my place was wherever my family needed me. But then Sabrina laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Honestly, Lydia, you're making this into some grand tragedy. You're lucky anyone still wants to deal with you after that scene out there. The decision settled in me like a stone dropping into still water. You know what, Sabrina? I said quietly. You've just made this very easy. I turned to Omar. When do we leave? His eyes softened, and for a moment I saw the young man who had once asked me the same question under the hum of hospital fluorescence. Whenever you're ready, he said. Graham shifted in his seat, looking between us like he couldn't quite believe I meant it. Mom! You had your chance, Graham, I said, not unkindly. For years I've made excuses for your distance, for your indifference. But tonight? Tonight you showed me exactly where I stand, and I'm done standing there. He didn't respond. Maybe he couldn't. Omar extended his hand, and I took it, not just as a gesture of agreement, but as a quiet promise to myself. This time, I wouldn't choose the safe path. This time, I'd choose the one that saw me. The calls started before I even got home. Graham first, then Sabrina. I let them go to voicemail. By the time I'd kicked off my shoes, the texts began, short at first, then longer, each one dressed up as concern, but laced with guilt. We need to talk. You're overreacting. Don't ruin this relationship over one joke. I didn't answer. The phone rang again. I almost let it go, but something in me wanted to hear what they'd say when they thought I was cornered. I swiped to answer. Mom? Graham's voice came fast, too bright. Finally. Listen, we need to get past this. You can't just cut us off because of one bad moment. One bad moment? I said. Graham, that was the clearest moment of my life. You're blowing it out of proportion, he insisted. You've always been sensitive. You know Sabrina didn't mean anything by it. She meant exactly what she said, I replied. There was a pause. Then Sabrina's voice slid in, smooth and falsely sweet. Lydia, it's Sabrina. We should meet for lunch this week. Clear the air. I'm sure we can put this behind us. Put it behind us? I repeated. You humiliated me on purpose. Why would I want to put that behind us? Because, she said, the sweetness thinning, family sticks together. And it would be a shame if people thought you were turning your back on your son over something so silly. There it was, the shift from charm to control. I felt my grip tighten on the phone. Sabrina, I've been his mother for 37 years. You've been his wife for 5 minutes. Don't lecture me on family. She laughed, a brittle sound. Well, if you're going to be stubborn, I guess there's nothing I can do. But don't expect us to keep reaching out if you're going to freeze us out. Good, I said, and hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment. Then, without another thought, I opened my contacts and blocked both their numbers. The quiet that followed felt clean. No buzzing, no interruptions, no manipulative little hooks trying to pull me back into their orbit. I set the phone down and stood in the middle of my living room, looking at the space I'd filled with 30 years of life. It didn't feel like home anymore. Not since the laughter in that hall. Not since I realized that all the sacrifices I'd made for Graham were invisible to him. That was when I knew, really knew, that I was leaving. I found a stack of flattened moving boxes in the garage, left over from when I'd helped a neighbor relocate. One by one, I opened them, the cardboard crackling as it took shape. I started in the kitchen, plates we'd eaten hundreds of family dinners on. Mugs Graham had given me for Mother's Day back in high school. His handwriting on the gift tag still burned into my memory. I wrapped them in paper and packed them carefully, but each one felt lighter going into the box, like I was packing away a chapter I didn't need to reread. The living room came next. Framed photos from trips we'd taken when Edward was alive. A knitted throw my mother had made. The space under the coffee table where Graham used to sit and do his homework. With every item I wrapped and placed in a box, I felt something shift inside me, like I was reclaiming square inches of my own life. Upstairs, I opened the closet and pulled out dresses I hadn't worn in years, shoes I'd saved for the right occasion that never came. They went into boxes, too. By the time I reached my bedroom, the sun had gone down. The house was dim and quiet, but not in the hollow, lonely way it had been since Edward died. This was different. This was the quiet of choice. I stopped in front of the dresser, my hand on the drawer where I kept the last few pieces of jewelry Edward had given me. I opened it slowly. The pearls from the wedding. The gold bracelet from our 20th anniversary. I held them for a moment before setting them carefully into a small velvet pouch. They were part of my past, and they would come with me, not as anchors, but as reminders. When the last box of the night was taped shut, I stood in the center of the room and looked around. Bare walls, empty shelves. It no longer felt like my house. And that was fine. This wasn't about losing a home. This was about building a life that finally belonged to me. The knock came just after 9 in the morning, sharp and insistent. I was in the kitchen, sealing another box, when it sounded again. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. I didn't need to check the window to know who it was. Still, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to the front door. When I opened it, Graham was standing there, hair slightly mussed, wearing the same jacket from the wedding. His eyes flicked over my shoulder at the half-packed living room. "So it's true," he said quietly. "You're really leaving." "I am," I replied. He shifted, glancing back toward the driveway where his car idled. I caught a glimpse of Sabrina in the passenger seat, arms crossed, face turned deliberately away from the house. "Can we talk?" he asked. "We are talking," I said, stepping onto the porch so he wouldn't come inside and muddy the resolve I'd built over the last 48 hours. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that used to make me want to smooth it for him when he was a boy. "Look, Mom, I know things got out of hand at the wedding. It was supposed to be lighthearted. I get now it came across wrong." "Came across wrong?" I repeated. "Graham, it didn't come across anything. It was exactly what it looked like. Public humiliation. And you didn't just allow it, you joined in." He flinched, but pressed on. Okay, but I'm here now. We can fix this. How about... He hesitated, like he was working out the right offering. How about we start having dinner once a month? Just the three of us. Make it a thing. I stared at him, almost stunned at how little he understood. Once a month, I said slowly. That's your idea of repairing this? It's a start, he said, defensive now. We're busy people, Mom. But we can make time for you regularly. I'm trying here. I took a breath, the cool morning air steadier than my pulse. No, Graham. You're negotiating terms for tolerating me. That's not love. That's scheduling convenience. His mouth tightened. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in the weight of it. Harder? You think this is about difficulty? It's about value. You want me to be available when it suits you, silent when it doesn't, and grateful for whatever crumbs of attention you drop my way. That's not a relationship. That's a service arrangement. He looked down, jaw working, hands in his pockets. For a moment, I thought he might actually hear me, really hear me. But when he looked up, his expression had shifted back to that guarded neutrality. So that's it? You're just walking away? I met his gaze. Number. I'm finally walking toward something. There's a difference. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. And what about him? Omar. Yeah. You're just going to take off with a man you haven't seen in 40 years? I'm going to take off with a man who has shown me more respect in 2 days than you have in the last 5 years, I said, my tone even. And I'm going to do it because he sees me, Graham. Not as a burden, not as a punchline, just as a person worth loving. He shook his head. He's using you. You can't see it because you want to believe. Stop, I said sharply. The only person who's been using me is standing right here, and I've let it happen. That ends today. Down in the driveway, Sabrina honked the horn, short, impatient bursts. Graham glanced back at her, then at me, caught between two worlds. She's waiting, I said. He didn't move. Mom? His voice softened for the first time, but it was too late. Go, Graham. He searched my face for some crack in the resolve, some opening where he could wedge himself back into the version of me who would forgive without change. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Finally, he stepped back. Take care of yourself, he muttered. I am, I said. I watched him walk down the steps, watched him slide into the driver's seat without looking back. Sabrina leaned toward him, speaking quickly, her hands animated. The car pulled away, the sound of the engine fading until it was swallowed by the quiet. I stood there for a long moment, the morning sun warm on my face, the air still. Then I turned, went back inside, and closed the door. The boxes waited, and so did my future. The house was nearly empty when the knock came. I was in the living room, taping the last box shut, when the sound echoed through the bare walls. It was softer than Graham's knock had been, but certain, unhurried. I opened the door to find Omar standing there, crisp white shirt, charcoal jacket, and that same steady gaze that had cut through the noise at the wedding. Behind him, his car waited in the driveway, trunk already open. Ready? He asked. I glanced back into the house. The rooms looked larger now, stripped of the furniture and clutter that had once filled them. The walls were pale, marked in places where pictures had hung for decades. My eyes landed on the mantel, empty except for a single framed photo. Graham's college graduation. He had his arm around me in that picture, both of us smiling at the camera. I walked over and picked it up. The glass was cool under my fingers. We looked so close in that photo, so certain of each other. I traced the curve of his young face, the slope of his smile. Goodbye, kid. I murmured. Not bitter, not angry, just quiet. I set the frame back on the mantel. It didn't belong in my new life, but I couldn't throw it away either. Some things you leave not because they matter less, but because they matter differently. Omar didn't rush me. He waited at the door, his presence calm, patient. When I turned, he stepped aside to let me pass, then followed me out. The morning air was cool, the kind of crisp that makes you breathe deeper. He opened the passenger door, and I slid in, the scent of leather and faint cologne wrapping around me. The trunk shut with a solid click, and moments later we were pulling away from the curb. I didn't look back until we reached the end of the street. The house sat still, the curtains drawn, the lawn trimmed the way I'd kept it for years. It looked the same, but I knew it wasn't mine anymore. Not really. You're quiet, Omar said as we merged onto the main road. Just closing the door on things. He nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. It's not always easy to leave a place behind even when it's time. I thought about all the mornings I'd made coffee in that kitchen, the holidays where I'd filled the dining table with food, the years of waiting for Graham to walk through the door with something more than a quick hello. I thought about Edward, about the life we'd built, and the life I'd kept breathing into even after he was gone. And then I thought about the wedding, about standing at table 14 and realizing that I'd been moved to the far corner of my own son's life. The airport signs appeared ahead, bright against the sky. I exhaled, long and slow, letting some of the weight slide off my shoulders. Do you ever regret it? I asked. Leaving things behind? Only when I stayed too long before doing it, Omar said. His voice was even, but there was truth in it. I understood. We pulled into the departures lane. Omar parked and came around to open my door, taking my carry-on from me without a word. Inside, the terminal was buzzing, rolling suitcases, announcements over the speakers, the smell of coffee and jet fuel mingling in the air. It felt alive, moving forward. At the security line, we stopped. He handed me my passport and boarding pass. His fingers brushed mine, warm and certain. You're sure? He asked. I was sure the moment I blocked their numbers, I said. He smiled then, not the small guarded one I'd seen before, but something fuller, like the years between us had folded away. Then let's go. We walked toward the checkpoint together, but just before I stepped through, I glanced back one last time. Not at the house, not at the past, but at the version of myself who had stood in kitchens and living rooms waiting for something that was never coming. I left her there and stepped forward. The line moved quickly, the hum of the terminal carrying me along. Somewhere beyond the glass, a plane was waiting, engines ready, pointing toward a different sky. Omar was beside me, and for the first time in years, the road ahead felt wide open. The morning light in Aqaba was different, warmer, softer, as if the sun itself was in on the secret of the day. Omar's seaside garden stretched out behind the villa, a quilt of white chairs, pale lilac flowers, and the sea beyond, glimmering like a sheet of silk. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine and salt water, and for the first time in decades, I woke without that dull ache in my chest. Today wasn't borrowed from anyone else's life. It was mine. Guests arrived quietly, friends from his medical days, a few of my nursing colleagues who had kept in touch, neighbors from the old city who had brought trays of sweets in the days leading up to this. No one came out of obligation, no one because it was expected. They came because they wanted to see us happy. Omar stood at the edge of the garden talking to his sister, the wind catching the edge of his white linen jacket. His hair was more silver now, his face lined. But the steadiness in his eyes was the same as the first time I saw him across the hospital ward 40 years ago. I was 24, my hands trembling over a chart. He had asked if I needed help. Today, there was no trembling. I wore a simple dress, ivory silk, long sleeves, no frills. My bouquet was small, just lilac and white roses, bound with a ribbon that had once tied my nursing cap. As I walked down the short aisle, the murmur of the sea mingled with soft oud music. Omar turned, and everything else dissolved. The chairs, the guests, even the years between who we were then and who we had become. His eyes told me this was not a rescue, not a pity, not a second choice. This was home finding home. We stood before the efficient, the sea curling in slow waves behind us. When it came time for vows, I didn't need paper. I once chose safety over love, I said, my voice steady. It gave me many things, but not peace. Today I choose you, knowing it will never be safety I feel, but freedom. His hand tightened around mine, warm and sure. Omar spoke simply. I found you once and lost you. I will not lose you again. Not to distance, not to fear, not to the weight of other people's expectations. There was no roar of applause, just quiet smiles and the sound of waves filling the spaces between words. We signed the papers under a small awning, the ink drying fast in the sun. Then the music swelled, oud and violin weaving something tender and steady, and we stepped into the garden where tables were set with platters of fresh figs, olives and bread, still warm from the oven. People laughed, but no one shouted over each other. They came to talk, to listen, to be part of something gentle. I caught my reflection in the villa's glass doors once, bouquet in hand, my hair loose in the sea breeze. I barely recognized the woman who had sat silently at a wedding table months ago while her son and his wife traded cruelty for laughter. This woman's shoulders were lighter, her eyes clearer. As the afternoon slid toward gold, Omar and I walked to the edge of the garden where the stone path met the beach. My shoes sank slightly into the sand, but I didn't mind. The tide was low, leaving ribbons of wet earth glistening in the sun. He slipped his arm around my waist. Happy? He asked. Not happy, I said. Peaceful. Finally. A gull cried overhead. The air smelled of salt and possibility. Behind us, guests lingered over coffee, their voices soft and easy. Ahead of us, the horizon stretched, endless and bright. I thought of all the years I had measured my worth by someone else's approval, the decades of swallowing words, of making myself small in rooms where I had once filled every corner. Today, I was not small. Today, the life I had was one I had chosen without compromise. Omar brushed a strand of hair from my cheek. This is only the beginning, he said. And for the first time in so long, I believed it. 6 months can feel like a lifetime when you finally step into your own. By the time the news reached me, the jasmine outside our bedroom window was in full bloom, its scent drifting through the open shutters of our villa in Aqaba. I was drinking coffee on the terrace, the Red Sea shifting in shades of blue and silver, when an email popped up from an old neighbor. The subject line was simple. They've split. I didn't have to ask who. Graham and Sabrina's marriage had collapsed, publicly, messily, with all the drama Sabrina had once reserved for me. There were whispers about financial strain, about her charm running thin when the money wasn't flowing the way she'd expected. Graham, apparently, had been left holding debts and excuses. The old me would have felt a tug, guilt, maybe even a need to fix things. But the woman I am now? I closed the email and set my phone face down on the table. Omar was inside talking with his sister, the smell of fresh bread baking in the kitchen. The world around me was warm and alive, and none of it depended on the approval of people who had once made me feel small. I didn't reach out, not to comfort Graham, not to gloat, not even to say I told you so. I had learned that some doors, once closed, should stay that way, not slammed in anger, but sealed in peace. My days here were too full to spend looking back. Mornings started with walks along the shore, the water cool against my feet. Afternoons were for tending the garden, for teaching local nursing students in the small clinic Omar helped fund. Evenings were for watching the sun melt into the horizon from our balcony, my hand in his, no words needed. Freedom, I found, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic finales. It settles in quietly, like sunlight through a window you forgot you opened. And it changes everything. I still keep one framed photograph of Graham. He's about 8 years old in it, grinning wide, front teeth missing. That's the boy I raised. That's the love I'll always have for him. But the man he became under Sabrina's influence? That's a stranger I've chosen not to invite back into my life. Choosing myself didn't mean erasing my past. It meant refusing to let it own me. Some might call that revenge, but I've come to see it differently. Revenge requires you to stay tied to the people who hurt you, to keep them close enough that their downfall matters. I let go of that need. And in letting go, I found something far more valuable than the satisfaction of seeing them fall. I found myself. If you've ever been betrayed, humiliated, or made to feel less than in a room where you deserve to stand tall, here's what I'll tell you. You do not owe anyone your silence, your patience, or your proximity. You do not need to wait for their apology to reclaim your peace. And you certainly don't need to linger in their shadow just to prove you can outshine them. The truth is, the people who try to diminish you will eventually collapse under the weight of their own choices. It's not your job to push them. It's your job to walk away and keep walking until the air feels light again. I've been asked more than once if I'd ever consider reconciling with Graham now that Sabrina is gone. My answer is simple. I wish him well, but my life no longer has space for half-hearted love or conditional respect. I built something here that doesn't depend on anyone else's permission, and I intend to protect it. So if you're listening to this and wondering whether to take that step, to cut that tie, to finally choose yourself, let this be your sign. The moment you stop trying to rewrite someone else's story and start writing your own, everything changes. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's finally choosing yourself.